Hello folks, this is Nicholas Eidolon, and I am welcoming you back again to the dungeon. This is episode 10 of Analog Dungeon. So we are in double digits now, which is kind of fucking crazy. And I can't thank everybody enough for like coming and watching the videos and hanging out, and everybody's feedback, and everybody who likes and shares the episode announcements on Facebook and on Instagram. Just all the support has been really nice, and thanks to all the artists who make this music. It's so important to me, and I can't thank everybody enough. I don't really think we have a whole lot to bullshit about before we get to the actual releases in this episode, which is good. I don't need to spend half the episode rambling about nonsense. I do have this, which I can show off. This is a maiden's hair fern that I picked up today. And I've got this cute little skull planter, so I'll keep everybody updated on the growth as this thing lives on my desk. And in the background right now, you can hear Delmak-O. So this is a release from Delmak-O called Cerulean Tomb. So this is certainly not dungeon synth. This is more like a dark ambient sci-fi horror concept album. Delmak-O has some prior releases to this, but this is their latest one. And this is from the same artist who brings you Evergreen Refuge, Fogweaver, a plethora of other projects. A hugely talented musician. What's really cool about this one is that this is, you can see there, it's VCR 002 from Video Cassette Records. This is the second of 3 initial drops that a new label out of North Carolina has put out. Their main focus is going to be synthwave music. So this is sort of on the outlier of that, just sort of electronic ambience, but their main focus will be synthwave. It's operated by the artist behind the synthwave project Sigil Burner, which was another of the first 3 drops, the latest Sigil Burner album. And that person is also behind the Dungeon Synth project Aerith Ackby, who has put out a couple of really fantastic records on Fableglade Records and on Gondolin Records, and who has just put out a split with Fogweaver. So really great to see those folks releasing each other's music, making music together. And then the third release from Video Cassette Records' first drop that just happened a couple weeks ago was another synthwave project called Triptodon. So I'll drop a link to Video Cassette Records in the chat. Everybody should go and try to grab these while they're still in stock. I know this Delmak-O is getting pretty low. In fact, by the time we get to the episode on Wednesday, it may be gone, but hopefully everybody has had a chance to check some of these out. Great stuff, great presentation. We'll cover these in season 2 of Analog Dungeon for sure. Really am proud that this label was able to get these releases put out. Really beautiful work. All of these come with a Prog. Let's take a look at that right now, actually. So every one of these releases comes with a Prog of the album artwork. So that's a really fun, interesting, sort of nostalgic way to present your albums. Great little extra. I haven't seen anybody do that before. So yeah, that's Delmak-O with Cerulean Tomb, and that's going to play in the background. So today we are going to take a look at Dungeons Deep Records. So Dungeons Deep, I knew had been around a bit before they started to release Dungeon Synth tapes a couple years ago. I knew that it was sort of a revival for the label and they started to put stuff out again. But what I didn't realize until I started to put this episode together is that not only have they been around since 2005, I didn't realize they had been around that long. Like, I was only 15 when the label got started, apparently. But they've been producing and releasing dungeon synths since then, you know, before the revival era, before the term dungeon synth was coined even. So, I mean, I was in high school when all of this got started with Dungeons Deep Records. You know, I didn't realize they had that much history. And, you know, now they're huge, you know, in relative terms of our community. They're a big presence, huge and important presence. Probably one of the 3 largest labels, definitely with the most, you know, one of the labels with the most output, the most quality output. Definitely one of the best on U.S. soil, alongside Ancient Meadow, probably. They're based out of Ohio. They're operated solely by Andrew Fritz, who is a prominent member in our community. I'm sure everybody's aware of him on some degree. And we'll actually be going over some of his own music today. But as the operator of Dungeons Deep, you know, he's just got this really keen ear for quality. He's got a keen ear for diversity in his releases, and just he puts out very interesting releases. And Dungeons Deep really feels like maybe the most forward-thinking dungeon synth label to me, by which I mean they really seem to look for music that doesn't always fit into the black metal rooted mold. It doesn't always have to be dark or depressive. A lot of their catalog sort of pushes in this direction of what I try to distinguish as fantasy synth when I talk about it here. So stuff that, you know, I do regard as dungeon synth, and you know, at least as far as my opinion goes, but it has a clear intent as being rooted as fantasy media. You know, this is not ambient black metal, it's fantasy music. And also, I feel like they're forward-thinking in terms of their production and their packaging. You know, Andrew's design skills are top-notch. They're just beautiful releases. They're fun and exciting to look at. All the design work is always great. The Dungeons Deep stuff always jumps out to me. And Andrew has started to dabble in vinyl, like a lot of folks have been lately. So, you know, they've got releases out already on vinyl from heavyweights like Lord Leviticus and Hedge Wizard, which those two alone are wildly impressive. And just the catalog is getting deeper all the time, and they've really put out some great stuff, some of my favorite stuff, and I've pulled some of my favorites today. So we can just sort of look at an overview of what Dungeons Deep Records has to offer. So, let's see. Let's take a look at our first album. This is a project called Titan. This is one of the most recent releases from Dungeons Deep Records. This is an album called One. And this is the first release from this Wisconsin-based artist. This artist also has a track called The West Wield that was featured on the digital compilation Dungeons and Catacombs 10 that came out in July of 2019. And then they released this EP. When this first came out, it was only 4 tracks. It came out in October of 2019. And that version, that 4-track version, had a handmade CDR that was available from the artist at the time. This version, this Dungeons Deep version, has 2 tracks, 2 extra tracks at the end. So it rounds it out to a total of 6 tracks, right around 30 minutes. Let's open this up. This is on a really nice pro-dubbed, pro-printed, smoke-colored shell. And this beautiful cover here. It's a beautiful cover. This lone tower in the hills is from an artist called Avigor. You can find them at Avigor Art on Facebook. They've also provided art for L4, Barak Tor, Moon and Azure Shadow, just to name a few Dungeon Synth projects. They've also done a lot of metal releases. I think they're certainly one of those artists that has an iconic style in the scene. You can really sort of pick their art out. And the logo here was handled by Andrew, as well as all the layout. So on the inside here, we've got a sort of a shady portrait of the artist in a cloak. We've got a thank you section. We've got a quote from Ursula Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea at the bottom here. So when we talk about the music here, even when we start right at track 1, it's just immediately lush and vibrant, very atmospheric music. It's got these dreamlike strings and this sort of awe-inspiring, sweeping sensibility to all the sounds that are going on behind the main melodies. There's a really beautiful use of sound effects as well on this album. Rain and wind and bird song and all the really sort of fantastic forest sounds. These sort of natural sounds are really nice, like on track 3, which is called Ancient Ruins Hidden in the Old Forest. I think that might be my favorite track. It's got some really fantastic harpsichord that sort of meanders through the forest with us, and the sound starts to build with this inclusion of bowed strings and this really nice percussion. It all starts to get more urgent, and it sort of swirls around you in this deceptive way, like you're just sort of being swept up in this beautiful fantasy setting before you even realize it. So yeah, this is just some incredibly strong scene setting for me. It's this very strong sonic painting, really. I think track 4 on this album is going to be a favorite for a lot of folks that listen to it. That track is called The Shimmering Sands of the Silver Coast. And these track titles, God, they're really, really nice. Like the intended visuals, like the intended story is so clear. Like the suggestion is so clear with the music that goes along with it. But yeah, this track 4, has one of the most memorable melodies on the whole album, and one of the most memorable themes, I think, that runs through it. There's like an ocean sound behind everything, that's sort of the sound of the tide surging. It's around 7 minutes long, and it's probably the most immersive track that you could just sort of sink down into. So I think if you're going to check out one, check out track 4. I think it's really going to sell you on this whole album. The bonus tracks at the end are also very, very cool. The first one was called Beyond the Rolling Hills. Very cool woodwind sounds that I'm very fond of. My favorite of those 2 tracks is called Twilight at Windsong Bluff. That's the second one, so that's going to be track 6 on this album. There's almost a Morricone Western theme here with the way the strings work on this track. There's something sort of resolute and standoffish about it, even though it does fall into like the cleaner, lighter side that most of this album falls into. It's just a great one to finish the album on, and like the way the strings sort of cascade at the end of it is really beautiful. This is a really cool album, very much in the realm of what I would call fantasy synth, like we talked about. It's kind of polished, it's not too submerged in that dungeon sound, but it still captures that escapism in a very skilled way. It's an album to get lost in, I think. It's really got a lot to owe to like video game music. Even the Dungeons Deep listing says that. It's got like a clear reference to that PS1 era sound of fantasy RPG soundtracks. So it's definitely more on that side rather than being rooted in, any kind of like black metal or dark ambience. But I think there's just as much here that a fan of Depressive Silence is going to like as much as a fan of FIFA is going to like. So, no matter what side of the fence you're on about that, check this one out, because this is sort of the best of both worlds, I think. I think this is one that's going to please a lot of folks. So that's Titan with their album One. Alright, now this next album comes out of Finland. And this is an artist called Estoc, named for the weapon that's featured on the cover there. So that's a style of sword that is known for being able to pierce mail armor. It's called an Estoc. And this is an album called ChapterI. This was released in late 2019, December of that year. To my knowledge, this is the first release from this artist. Inside, we have a cream-colored cassette with these really lovely adhesive labels. I love these paper, adhesive labels. I don't know why. I've just become very fond of them, especially the way they look on a Dungeon Synth tape. The Estoc logo here, designed by Andrew. All the design work here, the layout done by Andrew. Now the J card itself here features a painting from a California-based visual artist called Christian Claudio. And then the layout itself that Andrew did has a lot of really nice medieval art on it. I really love this J card design. It's really a work of art in itself, and there's such a rich bounty of that medieval art to pull from for this kind of stuff. Like, I really love these two illustrations by the track listing here. Like, look at this little dragon dude. Like, I love that dude. This is so cool. So this is yeah, 9 tracks it looks like. So we open here with a track called Prologue, which is just this slow plodding kind of track. Like, it moves along at a very even pace. Flutes are featured heavily here, alongside these nice choral synths. It's very serene. It almost has a new age tinge at certain points, but it's got a very heavy medieval vibe to it. Very old school fantasy soundtrack vibes. That's followed by a track called Unfolding Story. I really like the way that this track grows. It starts as this sort of benign medieval jaunt, and it ends as a sort of really dramatic call to adventure. Like, it just builds on itself in a really pleasing way. The progression is really nice. On track 3, that's called Fireside, we open with tones that are incredibly reminiscent of Fief. So we're talking about Fief again now, that sort of bright sunlight on cobblestone kind of feeling that you get from the project like that. The percussion in this track is really nice. The way it plays with the other elements, it's got like a start and stop structure that's really fun and dynamic. So there's just a lot of cool ideas here that, harken back to something like Fief, but sort of go in different ways, sort of elevate the style a little bit. Despite the similarities, it's very much its own thing. Track 4, that's got an interesting name. It's called Cathedralia. This one switches gears a little bit. The atmosphere is just very heavy and prominent. There's lots of choral synths, some sort of breathy voice effects that come into play in the rhythm section, and there's this driving organ and harpsichord behind everything. It gives it this huge gothic vibe, alongside these like church bells. So very interesting direction there to go in that gothic direction. I really love this track. So after you listen to the first couple on this album, and then you get to this one, it's such a hard shift into a different direction. It's really cool. The swirl of elements that you get with this one, very, very cool songwriting. Then things rubber band back on track 5. That track's called Potion Flask. So all of a sudden we're back in that bucolic pastoral fantasy realm, but it's a really busy and energetic track. The percussion here and really across the whole album, very interesting. The percussion, I think, is a good place to focus on one of your listens. Like, just go through it and listen to the drums. and the way they play with everything else in a lot of these tracks. But yeah, Potion Flask is this really fast-paced ride through a countryside or a town market. It's just really fun. And then track 6, that's called Green Hill Fortress. That one dials it back down a little bit from Potion Flask. This is a more somber track, a more somber tone, very restful and meditative. There's a serenity about this track that, again, makes me think of something like a New Age sound. And then finally we get to Epilogue, which is our last track in the original track listing, not counting the bonus tracks that we have on this one as well. But Epilogue is the last album track, which is just a soft, peaceful ending, like watching video game credits scroll. It's kind of like we're looking out on this countryside at night from the hills, and you can sort of hear fireflies in this track. You can sort of hear the starlight in this track. It's just a very serene nighttime feeling. It's an incredible piece to end the album on. So, excluding those bonus tracks, if we just look at those original 7 tracks, the structure and the flow is really great. We build from these sort of bright, fantastic tones into this adventurous, fun territory in the middle, maybe a little bit of danger toward the middle. And then we sort of dial it back down into introspection and relaxation and this emotional depth at that final bookend with Epilogue. This is worthy of a lot of listens. I would definitely go pick this one up and just give it 5 or 6 listens. Really, it's not that long, but it's just so worth it because there's a lot of stuff that's going to jump out at you from this. And again, that's called Chapter 1, so hopefully we've got further chapters to come from this artist. This is a really great first release. That's Estoc with Chapter 1. Let's see where we are. All right. So now we're going to talk about the infamous, the controversial, and the undeniably classic Diplodocus Slow and Heavy. So, what is a Diplodocus? Well, Diplodocus, according to our friends from the Wikipedia, which is probably what your high school librarian called Wikipedia, in a disdainful tone, I would imagine. I know mine did. This is a genus of diplodocid sauropod that lived toward the end of the Jurassic era during the Kimmeridgian age, which is apparently around 152 to 157 million years ago. What does that have to do with Dungeon Synth? I have no idea. I don't really care, and I'm not going to argue with anybody about it either, because there's more important shit to argue about. So for our purposes, this is Dungeon Synth, or maybe we can call it Dino Synth, which is a genre that doesn't really seem to have caught on like Comfy Synth has. I guess people like grandmas a little more than they like dinosaurs. That seems kind of crazy to me, because dinosaurs are fucking rad, but I guess grandmas can be rad too. Who would have known? If you desire more Dino Synth after we talk about this, there are a couple of places you can go. One of those is Synthosaurus, which is okay, probably not my favorite project. Not something I've listened to a great deal. It's not bad. Just, I don't know if I'd go out of my way to recommend Synthosaurus. Kind of more parody than an earnest experiment like Diplodocus is. The other project which I will always recommend, and that actually predates Diplodocus, is Cerulean with their album Skeletal Memory. Totally different from this release, but certainly falls into that category of being a very earnest attempt at capturing this primordial sound. So that's one that I would definitely check out and compare it to this Diplodocus release. it's pretty interesting. So I have 2 copies of this. I also have a copy on CD, which we will not be looking at here because the title of the show dictates that we can't. But we can look at these tapes. It also looks like some vinyl might be coming soon, so that's cool. Maybe we can look at some vinyl of Diplodocus in the future. These 2 tapes are the first and the second edition. The first, which we will open up now, this originally came on an orange tape and a green tape. I really wanted to get both. I did not get both because it was a limited quantity. I knew a ton of people wanted it and it was going to sell out, so I just got one. I've always regretted that, so if you want to sell me your green copy, please let me know. But I got the orange. This has a really cool reversible cover. So on this side, we've got what I believe is a Diplodocus. And then on this side, we've got this sort of T-Rex scene with a couple of other dinosaurs here. I'm not sure what those are. Again, all the design work, the logo and everything is done by Andrew. The second edition here, which we will pull out now, is the same design for the tape, but this one is on a white tape. And this one actually features a bonus track. And the J card is a little different here. So this J card actually folds out, and we've got both of the original covers here. So I think the reason this has 2 covers is because when it was originally released on Facebook, you had the slow side and the heavy side. So it was actually released as an A side and a B side on Facebook with 2 separate covers. And then on the inside here, we've got a quote from Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World. And this reads, "It was surely well for man that he came late in the order of creation. There were powers abroad in earlier days which no courage and no mechanism of his could have met. What could his sling, his throwing stick, or his arrow avail him against such forces as have been loosed tonight? Even with a modern rifle, it would be all odds on the monster." And that's from Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World. So, you know, paying tribute to the awesome might of these primordial beasts. So, when we talk about the music here, actually, let's talk about, before we get to the music, let's talk about another quote here. And this is from the artists themselves. This is what's on the actual Bandcamp page. This album pulls inspiration from dungeon synth classics as well as antiquated portrayals of dinosaurs through comics, silent film, and children's books of the past. So keep all that in mind when you listen to this and when we talk about it here. There's reasoning behind what this album was. This album was not made as a joke. It's a very serious album, in my opinion. But let's talk about the music. So this opens up with Prowl of the Concavenator. This is just sort of a perfect entryway into the album. It really lets you know what it's about. It starts with these roars, these growls, these primordial forest sounds, this sort of deep jungle murkiness, and these huge pounding drums, these ancient horns. There's just such a flavor that's established right off the bat here. On track 3, you get these really amazing, mesmerizing flutes. That's called the Grazing Antarctipelta. That's track 3. On top of the sort of deft skill and novelty of some of this, and there is some novelty to it, this joy that's coming from the creative experience and the listener's experience when you're talking about this album. We've really got some emotional moments as well. We've got some moments of real impact. Let's look at track 5. That's called faint burning glimmer in the Mesozoic sky. So on top of the really excellent wordplay there's a deeply moving sense of dungeon synth. I'm sorry, there's a deeply moving piece of dungeon synth. And if it were packaged a little differently, you know, this had a castle on the cover, it would be hailed as a masterpiece. That's such a strong track. The same goes for the first track on the B side, Return of the Thunder Lizard. You know, this track is just triumphant and sword wielding. Only in this context, we're talking about swinging a giant squamous tail rather than a sword. But that barbaric swagger is there that you hear on something like Dragonwind, for maybe. What I really think about when I listen to this is how dungeon synth is a lot of the times an exploration of a sort of otherworldly escapism. It's sort of a transport to an older time, and not necessarily an older time that exists, but it's sort of in reverence of a contrived idea of a past, or of a world that sort of resembles our past. There's just this longing to it. There's this isolation to it. And now in our current scene, I think what feeds into it really heavily is a lot of nostalgia. But it's kind of accomplishing the same thing as sort of longing for this ancient time. For me, it's sort of about creating that liminal moment of isolation, of transportation to this unreal place. And what this artist is doing with these sounds, these dungeon synth vibes from these classic releases, is combining it with that nostalgia of, you know, being a kid and dinosaurs are fucking cool, and then, you know, you have this layer of this swampy, hard to discern ancient world that you put over it, and it's all here in auditory form. And that's kind of an achievement to me. You know, they're taking these sort of disparate elements of childhood nostalgia and the idea of the ancient world that's so prevalent in dungeon synth, and I feel like they're just following it through to a conclusion. And again, you know, there's no parody going on here. Like, this is a very earnest exploration of that idea. But, you know, to set that stage and really take the listener into this primordial setting, that's really an accomplishment. You know, you see through this ancient fog, you see these Ray Harryhausen dinosaurs marching across the forest. This album is just perfect in that regard. Like, it absolutely does what it sets out to do. And there's never going to be another album like this. There can be imitators to this, but this is a very unique album. I don't think that can be denied. So that's Diplodocus's Slow and Heavy. All right, next up, we've got a huge favorite for a lot of folks in the scene. This is just a masterpiece of the genre, frankly. This is Hole Dweller's debut album, Flies the Coop. This is just perfection committed to tape. Hole Dweller is a project from Tim Rowland, who on this album goes by Roland the Recluse. Elsewhere, Tim has released dungeon synth as Bellkeeper, which is a Dark Souls themed project. He has the recent release Spell of Unseeing. He's made death metal as Sculpted Horror, black metal as Lothric, grindcore as Chopping Mall, and he's behind the retro video game music inspired Shenmue project Forklift Operator, which is getting a release soon. Tim is an absolute powerhouse of great songwriting, and here we see him sort of dive headfirst into full-on narrative-driven fantasy ambience. This is on a really beautiful cassette. Let's open that up. So this is a white cassette printed with the Hole Dweller logo here that Andrew designed. Got some maps of Middle Earth printed right on the shell. The cover features our titular Hole Dweller. So that's the Hobbit jam line. And this is a rendition from an artist named Paul Noble. This J card actually folds out, and on the inside we've got this huge illustration, this sort of sketchy illustration from Paul Noble as well. And then on this side, we've got a lot of text. What this is a track-by-track account of the short story that Tim wrote to go along with this album. So this is detailing Jamline's journey through the story of this album. This came out in August of 2019, and it made a pretty good impact when it came out. It's usually regarded as one of the best of 2019 alongside Fogweaver's debut. And I really think that those two albums sort of marked a step up in the lighter fantasy nostalgia branch of Dungeon Synth. You know, this has been, this album was followed then by Returns to Roost, which is a sequel that's really in a totally different sonic vein, very progressive and prog rock influenced. We'll take a look at that one at another time. And this past week, as of the recording of this video, a direct sequel, Flies the Coop 2, was released to continue the particular story here. I have not had a chance to listen to that yet, so I plan to do that when I'm done recording this. So musically, this starts out with a track called With Dreams of Adventure, I Smoke from My Long Pipe Beneath the Stars. So that opening has its synths just fully submerged in the mud of Frogmorton Swamp, the home of Jamline the Hobbit. The music here is noisy. It's just lo-fi as fuck. Like it's constantly coming through like a broken speaker. And I really like that approach. You know, taking this fantasy ambience that's certainly intended to be on the friendlier side of the genre, and then just layering it with that raw, nasty edge. You know, adding that age to make it something fairly unique, definitely nostalgic for like the fantasy of the fantasy movies of the 80s. Huge influence, I think, from Ralph Bakshi's late 70s animated Lord of the Rings film. And that texture here, like we find on a project like Coniferous Mist, for instance, you know, it adds so many layers of depth and interest to a project. It adds like a richness to the sound, this sort of thickness that verges on the dungeon noise territory, but it doesn't really feel right to call it dungeon noise here. One of my personal favorites here, and I think one that really illustrates that richness well, is track 3, titled Along the Great East Road, Cows Graze on Emerald Fields. Not only does that have some of the best melodies on the album, but it really wraps up, it wraps you up in that sort of warm, noisy drone that goes on behind everything. And there's a lot of emotional depth here as well. One of my favorite parts of the included story is the story for track 4 and 5. So those tracks are called An Apple Tart Between Seed Cake and Buttered Scone, and Memories in Wildflower and the Setting Sun. And here in the story, in track 4, we have an almost slice of life, stream of consciousness moment where Jamline is eating a scone and sitting on a stump and suddenly recalls a memory of their mother and father. And that leads into track 5, where the memory is recounted. So not only do we have this really excellent storytelling in this sort of short fantasy story genre, but the sonic representation of that is just heart-wrenchingly beautiful. That's another thing that Dungeon Synth is about to me, taking your subject matter very seriously, even if it's just a fucking hobbit, you know, even if it's a dinosaur. Like, you're taking it very seriously. You're not making a joke out of it. It's something personal to you. There's something personal to you in that story you're trying to tell, or that mood you're trying to get across. And I think that's really important in good Dungeon Synth. I'm not going to go through this whole album. This is one that you really need to experience, and I hope you have. I highly encourage you to go listen to it if you haven't. And even if you have and you haven't read the story, go do that. Go open the lyric tabs on Bandcamp or unfold the J card if you've got a copy, and just experience all of it. It's just a masterpiece, and it's a hugely pleasurable work to dive into. This is on vinyl now as well, so you can read that story on a nice big vinyl insert. Huge piece of work. Very important entry into the Dungeons Deep catalog and the Dungeon Synth canon. That's Hole Dwellers Flies the Coop. Let me hydrate real quick. All right, next we're going to look at another 2019 debut. This is Borg out of Sweden with their album, The Triumph of Spring. I remember when this came out, I was browsing the Dungeon Synth tag one morning, and this immediately caught my eye. Like, the cover was just very vibrant, very interesting, and the music itself just captivated me. Like, I was totally not expecting what I got when I started to play this album, and I was immediately craving a tape release of this. Well, I was so glad when it found a home at Dungeons Deep, who, of course, I knew would do right by it. I knew they would put out a quality release. And this just further leads credence to Andrew's ear for excellent, eclectic material. So the artist who made the cover and the music is credited as Borg. Borg seems to mean fortress, but I'm not sure that Morlack means anything. On the J card here, we do have an artist's self-portrait of Morlack. And on the inside here, we have a rendition of Death, and we have a poem in Swedish that reads, "Sun, sing ice to thaw, free the spring river, oh, the clothing of the forest sprouts, sing the sorrow from your heart, welcome the king of leaves, sing the sorrow from your heart at the triumph of spring." And then this comes on this really beautiful, vibrant green cassette with that Borg logo that I think must have also been designed by the artist. Love the design work here. Really beautiful. Right away with, excuse me. Right away with track 1, that's called Valborg's Vows. This is just something special. I wish I knew more about Swedish folk music. I assume that there's a lot of traditional instrumentation going on here because it sounds very old and very folk-inspired. All of these sort of off-kilter horns and strings, it's all very festive and ceremonial. It's this sort of cacophonous fanfare that introduces the album. It's just this really bold entrance into this pagan setting. Most of the tracks on this album are sectioned off into groups. So starting with track 2, Welcome Spring, we have a trilogy of songs that automatically starts to feel more subdued than the opening track. Very somber intro after that opening track with all of the folk instrumentation. Very much a return to Dungeon Synth form, I think. But the arrangement and execution here, it's much less chaotic. It's almost sparse and minimal, but it's just as profound. There's some great resounding drums here, just a lot of really nice tones. The next track, The Death of Winter, which is the second part of our first little trilogy of songs, that's a very sad farewell to the winter season. It's mournful and reverent, with some of the most beautiful strings that you're going to hear. And then that's followed by the third piece of this first trilogy called The Leaf King Returns, where a lot of those discordant folk instruments come back. There's this huge horns, this wailing vocalization. This one sounds like a huge celebration. It's really kind of crazy that one person put all this down. I've said that about albums before. It's just kind of wild that there's just one person behind all of this. There's just so many interesting ideas going on here, and I could talk about every song on this album, and it's like 15 tracks long, and they're not all short tracks either. I mean, they're pretty decently sized tracks. Like, I don't even know what some of the instruments I'm hearing are. Like on the end of track 5, I don't know what the hell's going on there, but it sounds amazing. And just like Hole Dwellers Flies the Coop, this is one that you've really got to experience. It's one of the most interesting albums out of 2019, and it's one of the most interesting albums in the Dungeons Deep catalog. Just going over some other highlights from this for me. Track 8, The Side of an Old Friend. We get this really fast-paced ringing percussion and something that kind of sounds like a kazoo, has like an almost vocal quality. Again, not sure what that instrument is. Track 10, Valor and Love. This somber, emotional respite from the rest of the album. This very introspective, very cathartic. Track 12, The Choosing Ceremony, has this dark, mysterious mouth harp. It's very ritualistic and mesmerizing. Like, the list just goes on and on. You know, there isn't a bad track here at all. Go listen to this as soon as you can. Like, there's a smorgasbord, really, of just really cool songs here. Borg has another album that was released in February of this year. That got a release, a cassette release on Gondolin Records. It's called Woodland. Borg, hopefully they'll have something out maybe next year, maybe by the end of this year. I don't know, but I definitely hope they keep putting music out, because this is a really, really unique project. So that's Borg's The Triumph of Spring. And this is our last entry, and this is a tape that was released in 2019, but it's actually an album that's been in the Dungeons Deep catalog for much longer. This album was first released by Dungeons Deep all the way back in 2006. This is Forgotten Land, and the album is called A Forest Is Mine Home. So everybody commonly agrees with the idea, I think, that Dungeon Synth as a term was coined in 2011. The 90s era, branching off of black metal, makes up that early canon, the foundations, along with something like Danzig's Black Aria or Kirkwood's early catalog. All of that sort of makes up the roots and the foundations of Dungeon Synth. So that leaves stuff like this, I guess, in a strange place. So this 2000 through 2010 material, that's sort of post-first wave, pre-revival, I guess. These folks who were just taking their love of black metal and fantasy and all of these various elements associated with that and making this sort of strange style of dark ambient that they wanted to hear. I'd love to hear this artist talk about that era and their feelings on it. And this is one that I don't see talked about a whole lot. you know, it does get it does get a lot of respect, but you know, I think I was a little ignorant of just how early on this album was made and how long the artist in question, Lord Tetrarch, being the moniker for this project, has had their hands in the genre. Like I said at the beginning of the video, Dungeons Deep has been around since 2005. So, you know, that's an interesting thing to think about when you look back at the early parts of their catalog. You know, they've really been trying to do this and sort of just waiting for this revival to happen for it to really take off. But it's been in their blood this long. So this is a really cool tape. It has a really beautiful O-card slipcover with just the Forgotten Land logo. And if we open this up, we see that it's on a white cassette. It's got some really beautiful printed illustration work on it from the Hobbit. This J card features some pretty dark artwork. I don't really know if the camera is going to pick that up too well. On this side, right here, we can see that it's dedicated to J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, and to a person called TJ, which looks like it might be a friend who passed away. It says rest in peace after that. And then it has some lyrics from the title track, which we'll get to. Then it has a beautiful illustration on the inside, I think, which might also be from a version of The Hobbit. And then all of these came with a Polaroid, which we can see here. I've got number 42 of 100. I believe all of these must have been different photos. And mine is a close-up of a snow-covered cedar branch. So very personal artifacts included here for what I think is a very personal release. So let's talk about the music here. Track 1 is simply titled Introduction. The synth work here is very somber, even paced, and really sort of drowned out by these natural sounds, bird song and stuff like that. All of that just sort of overpowers the synths on this intro. It's almost like the music is incidental, not really the point of this track. The main focus of this track is just the sound of nature, of the forest itself. The music fades and it just sort of leaves us with that natural ambience toward the end. Then we get to track 2. That's called Gollum's Cave. That starts out as all drums. It's all about percussion. We have this dripping cavern noise like water dripping into a dark pool. And that sound carries throughout the song and is joined by these drum patterns that it sort of interplays with in a really interesting way. The drums are almost martial at certain points. It starts to remind me of the intro that Conrad Schnitzler wrote for the Death Crush EP. Just something that it calls to mind for me. Then it's joined by these momentary bouts of this deep, dark, foreboding synth that just gives you the feel of stumbling around in the dark, you know, in this cave, encountering who knows what, running away from it, encountering it again, just being lost in this darkness. A really impressive track. So the next track is the midpoint of the album. This is the title track, A Forest Is Mine Home. Definitely the best track on the album. We hear the sound of the forest again, the synths start to fade in behind that. This is just true dungeon synth. This is what I think a lot of folks talk about when they're talking about true dungeon synth. It's deeply mournful, simplistic, deep bass and flutes over top of these depressive melodies. And then we get vocals here, these nasty, guttural goblin vocals recounting scenes from The Hobbit. Well, this is just really brilliant. It surely is this perfect mix of black metal sensibility, this fantasy influence, this sort of isolated escapist longing. Toward the end, the forest ambience just comes back with a vengeance. We've got wolves howling, we've got rain pouring. This is just a perfect track on this album. Following that, we have a track called Over Snow by Winter Sown. This feels like the most ornate track on the album, the most soundtrack-esque. There's a lot of layers going on here. This has those nice full drums that drive the track. We've got layers of synth melodies over everything. It's sort of like a rushing heroic piece, like we're rushing over this snowy landscape. And again, most soundtrack-esque portion of this album. Then we come to our last track, track 6. That's called Into Black Voids We Tread Our Maudlin Paths. So just like the title track, this feels like a black metal exercise to a certain degree. It's depressive, it's dominated by these drums. The synth tones are kind of wailing out. They're almost sharp in certain passages. Very classic sensibility here. Again, this was made in 2006, but it just feels like it belongs to that older canon, that 90s era. This whole vibe is just sort of that first wave of dungeon synth. So Forgotten Land has 5 other releases in their catalog from 2005 to 2008, including a split with Urukai. I can't stress enough that this is a really great entry into the dungeon synth catalog as a whole. I think this is a really important early work from an artist who is still pushing the genre forward in many ways. As a leading producer and supporter in the community, go do yourself a favor and pick up the Forgotten Land discography and talk about this album a little more, and all of those albums, because even to me, like I think I slept on the fact that this was such an important release. But that's Forgotten Lands, A Forest Is Mine Home. And this has been episode 10 of Analog Dungeon. And I'm just so happy you guys could come hang out. And we are almost finished with this season. We've got 2 more episodes to go. And then we are going to call it quits and regroup for season 2. So I will see you guys 1 week from today with episode 11. All right. Thanks, guys. See ya.